Boom, what up today? We're going to talk about one of our favorite topics, which is Raid versus Mythic Plus, the differences between the two. I made a video about this topic, thought about it a little more, and I came up with a fucking awesome analogy that I think is just straightforwardly right. And that is that Raid is football, American football. Mythic Plus is basketball. What does that mean? Well, what are the characteristics of American football? You have a big roster. You have really stop and go gameplay where you have one play that takes 9 seconds in American football, and then you sort of reset. Everyone gets back into their positions and they go again. American football is a game of preparation and strategy. You commonly hear people talk about like memorizing the playbook, having a bunch of audibles. It's really a tightly orchestrated dance where 11 players are moving in unison in order to like quite literally follow a scripted pattern of movement on the field for each play. In football, individual mistakes are really costly, and here I'm thinking of something like turnovers, where a turnover in football is pretty disastrous. Like, you're not going to score. You might be changing your odds of winning a football game from a turnover by tens of percents at once. There's a lot of specialization. If you look at offensive linemen versus cornerbacks, some players are 5'10", 185 pounds. Some players are like 6'8", 330 pounds. There's just a huge variety of body types and abilities that are on the football field at any given time. There's a big emphasis on the team over the individual, where pretty commonly people have started complaining that the MVP award in football is really relegated only to quarterbacks, which sort of shows that quarterbacks have a ton of influence over the game, but also demonstrates that every other role in football is not able to have an outsized impact on the success of a team. If you have the absolute best wide receiver in the league, or the best wide receiver of all time, surrounded by bad offensive players, you're going to have a bad team. Whereas if you have, above average or even just, average level players in every single position on your team, you're going to have a playoff team. So it's much more about like team cohesion and how good your median player is rather than how good your best player is. Football is also pretty fragile. Like, one person being out of position, one person hitting their mark, a couple seconds late, one person not understanding the play that you're running, one person, missing a block or something like that, will blow up an entire play. It's going to be completely rendered useless by, these small mistakes. Sort of similar to preparation strategy, it's heavily scripted. There's some amount of like reactive-ish gameplay on the line of scrimmage where quarterback might be reading the defense and calling an audible. Maybe you have like an option route where a wide receiver can see what the defense is doing and make a move based off of that. But for the most part, people know where they're going to go before plays run, and then they go and do that exact thing. And sometimes you'll even hear about offensive coordinators, scripting out the first 20 or 30 plays that a team is going to run. And like, they're not even deciding what they're going to do differently until, the end of the first quarter of the game. Secondly, there's a lot of dependencies in football where, you might have, a safety playing in one position on the field because of something the offensive line is doing. And then, that safety being somewhere might jam up a receiver that causes this other receiver to not, get open at one point, and then that causes a bad pass into tight coverage or something. Like, the chain of dependencies that lead to the eventual outcome of a play can be quite long, and it goes back multiple positions covering all parts of the field. What does this sound like? It kind of sounds like raiding in World of Warcraft, and maybe it sounds like that because I've chosen to highlight specific things that make it sound like raiding. But in a lot of ways, I think playing football and raiding are quite similar. Like, you have a tightly orchestrated strategy among a bunch of players whose individual contributions don't matter as much as their commitment to team cohesion does, and your best laid plans can be blown up by small mistakes. So it's a matter of like consistency and making sure that every step of this really Rube Goldberg style plan goes smoothly to get to your eventual outcome. So in comparison, what is basketball like? Well, 5 players. That's a pretty good comparison for Mythic Plus. It's very fluid. A lot of times a basketball play might be give the ball to this one good player and everyone get out of their way and let's see if they can make something happen. There's not as much really scripted gameplay. And similarly, it's very reactive. Like, you might have a set of heuristics with which you approach every play. Like, if this person's going to run a pick and roll in this kind of situation, this is our like first order defense, but we might have to adapt that based off of all the other circumstances of the play. So you have like rules-based heuristics that sort of govern your response, but for the most part, it's a lot of like instinctual reactions and coming up with things to do on the fly. Athleticism and skill really dominate here, where other team could have a very good strategy, and if you are much faster and much stronger and a much better shooter than their defensive strategy, if you're like much stronger and much faster than the opposing team, their excellent defensive strategy might not matter much. Now, sometimes it does, like we saw this in the 2011 finals, where famously LeBron James was the best player in the world, extremely athletic, really dominant, and he got shut down by a really good defensive strategy by the Mavericks. But for the most part, you see like unskilled players who are just like physical outliers completely take over games because there's such a high amount of leverage to individual talent and individual ability. Similarly, like, the best coach, college team or amateur team would just get absolutely annihilated by, people playing pickup unorganized basketball who are, by really athletic, NBA level talent playing in a disorganized fashion because of the influence of extreme skill on the game. Similarly, like, the star power matters a lot, where like, one player on a good basketball team can absolutely carry that team, almost to the championship level of gameplay, and even if they're surrounded by relatively bad teammates, they can elevate the level of their team just a tremendous amount. There's a lot of opportunities where a basketball team might have 50 possessions in a game, so having a turnover, missing a shot, these aren't like really bad outcomes. They're minor setbacks, and you'd like to not have them happen, but you're going to have more opportunities to come back later. Everyone on a basketball court plays a pretty similar role, so you might have one guy who's a bit taller than the rest and a bit slower, one guy who's probably the smallest, the fastest, and the best ball handler, but over time these barriers between positions have really broken down, and a lot of teams play what is called positionless basketball now, where like you have 5 athletic 6'6" to 6'8" guys who all basically do the exact same thing and are sort of fungible with each other. And finally, I would say that like basketball has what I'd call a smaller unit of strategy in comparison to the long dependency chains of football, where like the dependency chain in basketball might be something like they ran a pick and roll, we switched in this incorrect way, and that caused this other help defender to rotate out in a bad position, and then they made a pass out for a 3-point shot or something. It goes like 2 or 3 layers deep, but not 5 or 10 layers deep. So, your unit of strategy might be something like the pick and roll that involves 2 players or something. It's not, multiple steps that involve 6, 8, 10 players at once. Only very rarely does that happen. Often there's like multiple people on a play who are totally irrelevant to the outcome or are just sort of like taking up space, or they're not as consequential in the grand scheme of things. So why does this make it like Mythic Plus? Well, like we said, sort of fluid 5-player gameplay, where Mythic Plus, like, you are going in with a small unit, and while you have a plan, a lot of your success is determined by your ability to adapt to the breakdown in that plan. And, I would say like the difference between Raid and Mythic Plus is almost that in Raid, everything should go right, and then you kill the boss. Whereas in Mythic Plus, you sort of hope everything goes right, but expect something to go wrong, and your success is determined by whether or not you're able to adapt to those things that go wrong in the moment. Like someone might miss a kick. How do you adapt that? It's like, well, we call our next stop, or this person moves their cooldown over, or this person goes and knocks the mob or something. You're planning to, use all of your battle reses sort of in reactive moments, as opposed to maybe like expecting someone to die at a certain spot like you might in Raid. Like on Razageth, you were sort of pre-planning to use your battle reses, whereas in Mythic Plus, you're sort of like saving them as emergency backups or something. Your cooldowns are set at much more free-flowing times, where you like maybe you're deciding how to pull packs based off who has cooldowns at some point, rather than following some really scripted timing where we're going to pull this pack at a minute 10 and then this pack at a minute 50. It's much more about adaptation to the present moment. Similarly, like being fast and sort of having good hands, having good throughput, influence your success a lot more in Mythic Plus than in Raid. This is what I mean. Like the athleticism and raw skill of Mythic Plus is sort of just being a gamer and blasting, rather than having a really good strategy and being really prepared ahead of time. Even though that does help, especially at the really high end of Mythic Plus, like you can go really far in keys by just, gaming out of your mind and like reacting to things as they come up. And I would say the like opportunity set, when I say that Mythic Plus has lots of opportunities, that means that you get to run a key dozens of times. And it sort of only matters like how well you do once, rather than in Raid where you're sort of fighting this clock and every mistake is relatively costly to, your ultimate ranking. You have similar roles where, like, yes, you have a tank and a healer. They're almost sort of like the, DPS numbers, 3.5 and 4 or something. Like they're each half of a DPS, and maybe the tank has aggro, and that means they do a couple things differently. But the routing is determined a lot by not just the tank, but also what the DPS are able to do. The tank are often just like DPS with more stops and a little more group utility or something like that. Whereas like healing in Raid is this really wild thing where you're following a really scripted cooldown set and thinking about totally different things. As opposed to like healer in Mythic Plus is often brought for their damage and the things that they bring to the group, and that's not too far off of why you bring DPS. It's like throughput and group utility. So yeah, I think this is a pretty useful analogy to think about the differences between the two games, or the two game modes, and in particular, it can be enlightening to explain why certain players struggle to transition between the game modes. Like if you bring a key player into Raid, they're still trying to play basketball when everyone else is playing football. You can imagine why that might not work. Is like they think that their individual throughput might matter a lot more. They're expecting to go in and like react to things as they come up. They're expecting to just sort of like come up with a plan on the fly and really adapt to the present situation. And all their teammates are like, no, we have a really scripted strategy. You deviating from that strategy is extremely bad. You making a small mistake like dying or something is extremely bad to our strategy. And these things are just like not the way that Mythic Plus operates as a game. Similarly, in Raid, you might have players who are really good at following some scripted set of execution steps. They're really good at preparing for something ahead of time when they know what's going to happen, but they're really slow to react to things on the fly, or like they're not able to make those really quick decisions when things go wrong. So they go in and they play a bunch of basketball as a football player. They get confused when things break down suddenly, and they don't know what to do. Yeah, let me know what you think.